All right, Alexander. So we finally have the Great Kherson Counteroffensive, if you can call it that. I'm not sure if it really is a counteroffensive or if the reasons for this action by the Ukraine military is something else. You can get into the details of it all. I've been watching all of the military analysis channels, the mapping channels as well, who are doing excellent work. And I've also read the reports from the Ministry of Defense and the Russian Ministry of Defense. So what I'm going to say is from the Russian side of things, because the Ukraine side of things is actually pretty quiet, or they don't seem to want to give out too much information, which is kind of interesting. They're usually the ones that are giving out a whole boatload of information, and now they're kind of quiet, tight-lipped about everything. But the Russian Ministry of Defense yesterday said that they repelled most of the attacks, though it does seem that one broke through. But really insignificant stuff. Anyway, you'll get into that. And they mentioned certain casualties at around 560. Well, today they've released a lot more information, and it seems like the casualties and the damage was significant, in the thousands. That's the latest report that we're getting once again from the Russian Ministry of Defense, and they don't seem too bothered about this. At least, the statements they're putting out, they just don't seem too bothered about this. The main battle, though, continues to be in the Donbass, and I'm starting to hear reports that Zelensky is moving because of the losses suffered in this offensive. They're moving forces from Odessa to Nikolaev to cover their tracks, kind of like a chain reaction in a way. And finally, my final comment and question to you is what I'm trying to understand. What was the purpose of this? What's the end game? Is it to take Kherson City? Is it to go after Mariupol? Is it to reach Crimea? I mean, I'm looking at a map and I'm saying, okay, what the heavy fighting, the important part is in Donetsk. What is the purpose of moving all of your assets to this one area and moving southeast, let's say? What's the end game? What's the goal here? And we'll probably get into that as the video goes along as to some other possible reasons for this this offensive, which, to be fair, as Brian at the New Atlas pointed out, this has been one of many offenses, counteroffenses that the Ukraine military has tried to put together over the last 6 months,
Yep.
going back to Kharkiv and various other offenses. Anyway,
Yeah.
that's kind of an update and a few questions thrown at you as well. What say you?
Well, let's start with that excellent question that you asked. What is the end game for this offensive? Because I get the clear impression that you're not the only person asking that question. I get the clear impression from all I've been reading that one other person who's been asking that particular question is the Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's Armed Forces, General Zaluzhny. And apparently he has been against this offensive right the way through. Now, it's very interesting that last night, even as this offensive was unrolling, and even as the political side of the Ukrainian government was telling us that this was, the great offensive, the Ukrainian general staff remained silent. They weren't talking about it. Now, you can interpret that in all kinds of different ways, but I can't help but think that the Ukrainian general staff are not happy with this. Apparently, they've advised repeatedly against this. They don't think it's a good idea. Right up until the moment when it started, I was getting report after report over the last couple of weeks, ever since August began, in the British media, Ukrainian military officials, Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines, saying that Ukraine is not ready to launch this counteroffensive. And it seems that the point that General Zaluzhny has been making to Zelensky, this is if you believe his reports, which I, by the way, do, is that all it's going to do is it's going to fritter away the reserves in the rear, which he's trying to build up in order to plug holes in the defence lines. And you can see that that is exactly what is happening. As you rightly say, they failed in a number of places, but they made very limited gains, or at least limited gains in one. If you believe the Russians, and there's good reason to believe the Russians in this case, because we're getting reports that the hospitals in Kryvyi Rog and Nikolaev, the two major cities behind the front lines, Ukrainian-held cities behind the front lines, that the hospitals are overflowing with wounded, and that apparently in Nikolaev there's now cause for blood to be provided, because to help these huge numbers of wounded that are coming in from the battles. If you believe the Russians, Ukrainian losses have been horrendous. They've been horrendous in men killed, in men wounded, though the Russians are not giving us estimates for men wounded, but you can probably multiply those figures by 3 on top of those that they report as dead. And of course, they're also claiming, the Russians are also claiming, that they're knocking out scores of tanks and armoured vehicles. And that's not surprising, because if you're advancing, and you're advancing against an enemy who has overwhelming artillery superiority and who controls the skies and who has helicopter gunships and missiles and aircraft and bombers and all of those sort of things, if you're leaving your trenches and trying to advance against an enemy with that kind of firepower, then you are going to suffer extremely high losses. And as you absolutely rightly say, what Zaluzhny is now having to do is he's having to plug the front lines, because his reserves are being frittered away, are being thrown away. He's having to fill them out by pulling in troops from all sorts of places. So we got reports yesterday and early this morning that practically the entire land forces that were previously protecting, shielding Odessa, this much more important city further west, have now had to be redeployed towards Nikolaev, because there's a real danger that after this offensive finally runs out of steam, the Russians will be able to move on Nikolaev, because the Ukrainian forces that were previously deployed there have been so massively depleted as a result of this offensive. So you could see the pattern. And coming back to your original question, what is the objective? Is it to capture Kherson city? Well, if you look at the main area of the battles, it's not actually pointing towards Kherson city. Is it to cut off, as some are suggesting, an area of Russian control west of the Dnieper, but not Kherson city itself? Well, that seems to be hardly worthwhile for this kind of expenditure of men and machines. What is the end goal? It really isn't clear. Now, we're getting reports. All of this, of course, are reports. They're rumours, but as I said, they're plausible rumours that Zelensky wanted to launch this offensive on the 10th of August. Zaluzhny and the General Staff said no. This was then postponed. There has been massive arguments. Apparently, there was a meeting on the 28th of August between Zelensky and the Ukrainian generals, including Zaluzhny. There's some reports that Zelensky actually threatened Zaluzhny with a sack if this offensive wasn't carried out. And anyway, we now have this offensive. So it looks as if you believe these reports, and it's plausible that the military are not happy with this, the military command are not happy about this, it's been forced on them by the politicians, and I suspect that the reason the politicians have launched it is for the same reason that they've done many things in many occasions over the course of this war. They're doing it for basically public relations reasons. They promised everyone that there was going to be a counteroffensive in Kherson region. They were getting a lot of blowback, particularly from the British, by the way, about the fact that this Kherson offensive hadn't materialized, so they felt they had to carry it through.
Okay, well, you're leading me right to my next line of questions. Boris Johnson in Kiev on the 24th, 25th. coincidence, or was he bringing the orders, the ultimatum to Zelensky and saying, "Look, either you get something going, or that you're going to lose all the support for this war because the support is waning in the collective West, in the United States, in the EU. So you better get something going." And can you, going off of that speculation, because it is speculation, but
Yes.
I'm asking you, is it a coincidence?
Yes.
Going off of that, uh, can you expand a bit deeper, a bit further into possible reasons for this offensive, counteroffensive, whatever you want to call it, outside of the military strategic reasons, which I think you laid it out perfectly. There really doesn't seem to be much of a real big military strategic reason. Maybe there's small military strategic reasons to do this, but I can't see the big picture here from a strategic point of view. But what are the reasons outside of a military reason to launch this offensive? You talk about Boris Johnson. Maybe you're talking about getting money for weapons. Maybe you're talking about NATO. Maybe you're talking about PR and media and public support. All of these things. Just expand on that a bit.
Well,
There is, just real quick, I did see on one military mapping channel, Theti mapping. Perhaps this is also to stop the momentum of Nikolaev as well. I just wanted to throw that out there to you as well. So, what do you think?
well, I think there's a lot of things to cover there. By the way, I think the Nikolaev thing is real, and I would agree with that. I think that what may have actually finally acted as the trigger is the fact that there is now clearly a threat to Nikolaev, and Zelensky can't afford to lose a city like Nikolaev. If he did, then it would really look as if the war was decisively going against Ukraine, and with support in the West for the war waning, and we're going to come to that in a moment, I think that probably pushed him over the edge, and it made him decide that something has to be done, and has to be done fast, to turn things round. So I think that's actually true, by the way. But I also believe, and I accept that it is a rumour, but I do believe this story that Boris Johnson came to Kiev and pressured Zelensky to undertake this offensive. Now, I want to stress, it's what I believe, it's what the rumours say. I don't have absolute concrete fact, but it is consistent both with what Boris Johnson has been saying and perhaps more interestingly with what the British Ministry of Defence has been saying, because the British Ministry of Defence publishes everyday bulletins about the progress of the war, except they're not bulletins about the progress of the war. They're basically media talking points, as I've discussed. But the day before yesterday, they published one which said that the Russians are intensifying their offensive in Donbass because they want to divert Ukrainian attention away from this counteroffensive that there are speculations that the Ukrainians are about to launch. So that gives a fairly strong indication that the British were being informed in advance by the Ukrainians, we knew in advance by the Ukrainians that there was going to be a counteroffensive of some kind. And it looks to me very much as if the British were pushing for it. And if the British were pushing for it, that means that Boris Johnson was pushing for it. Now, he has obvious reasons why he would want to push for it, because he's only going to be Prime Minister for a few more weeks. I mean, I think it's about 2 weeks' time. So he has led Britain into this position of unequivocal, unconditional support for Ukraine. And we're now getting opinion polls starting to appear, showing that there's a major shift in mood in Britain, that support for Ukraine is waning as people in Britain come under increasing pressure because of the collapse in their living standards. And there was a very big opinion poll about this in the Sunday Times on Sunday, which appeared to confirm this. So Boris Johnson, who has not given up on his career, this you can be absolutely certain about. He wants to be an important person in British life, even after he ceases to be Prime Minister. He doesn't want to be remembered as the person who led Britain into support for Ukraine, with Britain suffering an economic debacle and Ukraine suffering a military debacle. So it's quite likely, it's almost certain that he's pressing Zelensky to achieve some kind of military win in somewhere, somehow, in some part of Ukraine, so that Boris can leave the premiership and say, well, look, we're achieving progress. Ukraine is winning. We must keep this up. And then if afterwards Ukraine loses, well, it's no longer his fault. It's the people who came after him. He can say, well, they didn't follow through on that great lead which I gave them. So you can see Boris's personal interest in all of this. But the big thing, the great problem the British have, and remember the British are very committed to supporting Ukraine, the Europeans have, the Ukrainians have, the Americans have, is that public interest in this war is waning. And you're now starting to see more and more people saying the cost we are paying for this war is too high. We didn't expect when we signed up to this back in February that we're going to see our living standards collapse. And I was reading in Responsible Statecraft this morning, which is a publication by the Quincy Institute in the United States, that the Pentagon is now also pushing back. They're saying that their own reserves of military equipment are now disastrously depleted, that they are worried that if the United States found itself in another war, and the United States is always finding itself in some war somewhere, that they just don't have enough weapons. And the reason is that all their weapons are being shipped to Ukraine. So Zelensky has to do something in order to keep Western attention focused on Ukraine. So does Johnson in a kind of a way. And you can see how, in a sense, even if this offensive achieves nothing, militarily speaking, or rather, even if this offensive causes heavy losses for Ukraine, if it can just keep this thing running on for a few more weeks, well, you can just keep the money flowing into Ukraine, the arms flowing into Ukraine. You can keep the war, you can prolong the war for a little longer. And then maybe when that period ends, you can come up with something else. But you have to do that because Western weapon systems, arms supplies to Ukraine are dwindling. Western economic support for Ukraine is dwindling. Ukraine is heading into a major economic crisis, probably a hyperinflation crisis. So Zelensky needs to show that he's making some kind of progress somewhere. And that's why you can see that he's ordered this offensive in Kherson region. And that's also the calculus that is driving Johnson as well.
Okay, couple of questions. Does this play into Russia's hands in the end? I mean, you mentioned how we talked about how forces in Odessa have now been moved to Nikolaev because the forces in Nikolaev were engaged in this offensive. And you mentioned how the Ukraine military, Zaluzhny and his staff, are worried that if Russia, and I'm convinced Russia will, but let's just say if they manage to repel this offensive and push it back, they're going to, and defeat this offensive, they're going to have a much clearer path towards Odessa. Is this kind of, I don't want to say this was Russian 5D chess or strategy, but has Zelensky just gifted Russia with a very nice opportunity to make their way to Odessa, to an easier path to Odessa? Has Zelensky just gifted Russia with this? That's my first question. And my second question is, they're all in, aren't they? The collective West is all in with Ukraine. I mean, you mentioned the UK and Boris Johnson and how they have to get something going because people are just souring to this war. They're just not as interested anymore. But the entire collective West has completely pinned their entire existence on this Ukraine conflict. So who's going to crash first, Ukraine or the collective West?
Yeah, yeah. Let's start with your first question. Now, again, one always has, war is an unpredictable thing. There's always a chance, I suppose, that Ukraine could pull something out of the bag and achieve some kind of military success. I don't expect it. As you rightly say, the Russian Ministry of Defense seems extremely confident. I mean, they don't seem to be in any way rattled or unduly concerned by what's happening. On the contrary, one gets the sense that they think that things are going very much their way. Now, assuming that they are right, assuming, if the speculations are true, that Zaluzhny advised against it, then what you're saying, will this work out to the advantage of the Russians? The answer is it will, because, of course, from the point of view of the weaker side, it's always better to be on the defensive, to hold your positions for as long as you can, to fight the superior enemy from entrenched positions, from bunkers, from houses, from buildings, from trench lines, whatever, rather than deploy them, as Ukraine is now doing, in the open plains, where they can be attacked more easily and destroyed by the Russian Air Force and missile forces and artillery. So what Ukraine is doing is it's taking its troops out of the places where, they were protected, they were shielded by these concrete emplacements, these buildings, these houses, these trench lines, and it's making a perfect target, if you like, for the Russians to destroy. And that's why we are getting these reports that Ukraine is suffering these horrendous losses. Now, Zaluzhny, I have to say this about Zaluzhny. I mean, he's never provided Ukraine with a military path towards victory. I've never seen him come up with a plan about how Ukraine can actually win the war. But what he's been very effective at doing is he's been very effective at prolonging the war. He's fought a war on the defensive, he's kept reserves, he's put trenches, emplacements, bunkers, wherever you like, and that's why the Russian advance in Donbass has had to be gradual and incremental, why they can't break through. Now, what Zelensky and Johnson and others are doing is they're taking all those troops, putting them in front of the Russians are able to destroy them. There's the reserves which Zaluzhny has been trying to build up are getting depleted. And that logically will make the Russians, the work for the Russians going forward much easier and will open the path ultimately to Nikolaev and Odessa. Now, I don't think you need to be a great military theorist to see that. I think, it's obvious. I think it's absolutely clear. Now, as I said, perhaps somehow the Ukrainians can pull something out of this. It doesn't look as if they can. So far, their gains have been extremely limited. Arestovich, Zelensky's spokesman, was talking about only limited gains at the moment, and it's going to be very gradual and it's going to take a long time. Ukraine doesn't have the resources to fight an offensive in that way. And an offensive, that kind of attritional offensive, which is what the Russians have been doing in Donbass, works if the attrition is on the defender. But it doesn't work if the attrition is on the attacker, which it is in this offensive in Kherson. So I think to answer your first question, yes, I think all the pointers are that this will in the end work to Russia's advantage.
But before you answer the second question, I have to ask you, what is the thing that Ukraine is looking to pull out of this? Because maybe you said it, and I was thinking the same thing. Maybe Ukraine does pull something out of this
Yeah,
offensive. What is
yeah.
that something, though? I mean,
Well, I
what is
can't
it?
see.
Is it the capture of Kherson City? Is
Yeah,
it
yeah.
what would be a victory in this instance for Ukraine?
Well, I can't see one, to be honest. I mean, at the moment, perhaps I ought to say that the places that they've captured are places actually that they've recaptured, because there's been, movement backwards and forwards on this particular front line over the last couple of weeks. And these villages that we're now hearing about, Ardika and all these places, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. All of these places, they've swung backwards and forwards in previous battles. I can't see what Ukraine is going to pull off. Perhaps others can. I personally can't see it. But, war is an unpredictable thing. I suppose there's always a chance that perhaps the Russians will collapse. Doesn't seem likely to me, but perhaps the Russians will collapse. Perhaps there'll be some kind of military implosion on the part of the Russians in Kherson region. Maybe the front lines will collapse. I just don't see it myself, but there's always that hope. At the moment, there's no sign of it. I think I should say that. As of the moment of making this program, there is no sign of it. But I suppose one must always add that qualifier. War being unpredictable, there's always the chance that something might happen. Some military commander in Kherson region, some Russian military commander may make some egregious mistake, and that might give the Ukrainians an opportunity to slip through and achieve something. I'm not even sure what, but anyway. But putting these very unlikely possibilities to one side, it seems to me, coming back to your original question, that yes, ultimately, this is going to weaken the Ukrainians and strengthen the Russians. It's going to work to the Russian advantage. I mean, the offensive, I should say, is still underway as we're speaking. It doesn't seem to be proceeding with the same intensity that it was yesterday and last night, but at least there is some attempt by the Ukrainians to continue to progress, and we'll see how far they're able to continue with this and what happens if eventually they're forced to give up. So, but on the assumption that it fails, which I think is overwhelmingly likely, yes, it will work to the advantage of the Russians. Zaluzhny warned Zelensky about this. If you've been reading articles in the Daily Telegraph, The Economist, The Guardian, the London Review of Books, the Washington Post, all these sort of places, you see lots of Ukrainian officials all giving those warnings. Military officials giving those warnings, but they've been disregarded.
Right. Can you get into the collective West, the
economics.
US, UK, yeah, and the European Union, that they've bet everything, all their chips that are on the table,
Yeah.
they've bet it all on Ukraine. And just an interesting note, Alexander, I just saw a message come in, and in the intelligence update that the UK puts out there for the 30th of August,
Yeah.
2022, they don't even mention
No,
this
I noticed it.
southern counteroffensive.
Yeah.
What do you
Yeah.
make of that?
Well, it's another sign that it isn't going particularly well, because the British Ministry of Defence always talks up any Ukrainian success and downplays any Ukrainian failure. So the fact that they're not mentioning this, that they're not referencing this at all, is a sign that it's not going well. And if you follow the British media, which of course I do, then what you will see is that when the announcements came that Ukraine has started this great counteroffensive, it was a big headline. It was the big story. And then as the hours passed and the information came trickling in that things weren't going well, you could see that this story suddenly gradually melted away. And you still find some references to it, but it's no longer being given the prominence that it was, except interestingly by the Daily Telegraph, which is running an interview, or rather a YouTube thing, by Arestovich, of all people, about how the Ukrainians have broken through a Russian defense line. But this is the same Arestovich who tells us that this will be only a very gradual advance. But anyway, I
Can I ask
have
you,
to say,
Yeah,
No,
yeah, go
just
ahead.
to quickly say, I mean, if you're relying on Arestovich to give you good news, I mean, you're pretty desperate. Is all I can say. But that's all I'm going to say about that.
Before you get to the EU question, to the EU discussion and the collective West discussion in Ukraine, one more quick question: how do you pull off a counteroffensive without having air superiority and the proper logistics and supply lines? I mean, that's a serious question. How can that be, given the terrain as well?
Every single military analyst I've seen who's looked at this have said very simply that you can't. I mean, Daniel Davis has been saying this. Douglas McGregor has been saying this. People who are far more pro-Ukrainian than those two gentlemen have been saying this. Andrei Martyanov has been saying this. Every military professional I've seen who's looked at this, even some who are very pro-Ukrainian, say that you can't. And Ukraine did deploy, apparently, a couple of aircraft, two Sukhoi 25 ground attack aircraft, a small number of helicopters. Apparently, those two aircraft have been shot down, so have two of the helicopters. I mean, it hasn't been going well, and without air superiority, especially if you're fighting over open country, I'd have thought your situation is going to be absolutely desperate, and it'll be another reason why you're suffering the horrendous losses that the Ukrainians are indeed suffering. Now, on the economic, let's pivot to the economic things. It's a very, very, very good question. Now, I don't know whether you've read it, but there's been a brilliant article by Eve Smith on naked capitalism, on exactly the point that you've been saying. I mean, it's an absolutely outstanding article. Now, she makes exactly the point that you are making, that the collective West, especially the Europeans, are now utterly committed. They have no basic line of retreat that doesn't leave them completely humiliated. I mean, they're still desperately looking for ways out of this, alternative sources of energy. There was a desperate piece on Zero Hedge about Norway stepping in. It's increased gas production by 8%, and that's going to be enough apparently to make up for the loss of Russian gas. I mean, all of this is, it's hopeless, it's useless. And E. Smith makes 2 points. One is that all of these people, these political leaders, have come back from their summer holidays, and it's suddenly dawned on them how disastrous for people in Europe, especially, this is becoming. And by the way, she also says that it is impossible, given the fact that the real economy is going to start contracting soon with a vengeance, it's impossible that this isn't going to feed into the financial system, that we aren't going to see a financial crisis starting to blow up in a few months. And I think she's absolutely right about that. But she also says that these people have no plan B. Politically speaking, they're so committed. How does Robert Habeck reverse himself, pick up the phone to Putin and say, let's talk peace? How does Ursula von der Leyen, as I will continue to refer to her, you give her a more, shall we say, accurate name? How does she do that? How does Olaf Scholz, how does Emmanuel Macron, he who tells us that the great age of abundance is now ended, how do all of these people do that? And they can't, realistically. The only thing that they can do, it seems to me, is cling on, hope that something will turn up. And then if it doesn't, and the situation in Europe goes down the tubes, which it will, they can only do one of 2 things, it seems to me. One is cling on and intensify. I will call it by the simple word repression. And I've discussed over the course of our live stream yesterday this really dangerous, alarming article by people like Simon Tisdall in The Guardian about, the enemy within type rhetoric. And, you could almost certainly see a lot more of that over the next few weeks and months and going forward. Either they do that, or perhaps they say to themselves, we can't give up. We're too committed. We're too identified with this policy. We cling on. And then if we lose an election and somebody else comes in, takes a different course, well, we can always say that it's all their fault that things have turned out the way they have, because if we'd held on a little longer, things would have turned out otherwise. We may know perfectly well in our guts that that isn't true, but at least that gives us some kind of face-saving way out. Now, I have to say, looking at people like Ursula and Habeck and all those sort of people, I don't think that they think in the second way. I think they think in the first. I think that they're going to be looking to tighten controls, not to prepare for graceful exits. I don't think these people do prepare for graceful exits. So I'm afraid an economic crisis, that already is baked in the cake. We're going to be in a very severe recession in Europe in a few weeks, if we're not already in one. We're going to probably see a financial crisis as well, and we're going to see, I suspect, an intensifying campaign against anybody who talks peace. It'll be said that we're in an existential war with Putin, and that anybody who says that we should retreat or change course is somehow in their pocket. And I think that's the dismal future that awaits us in Europe. Now, ultimately, even that is unsustainable. There will be a crash, perhaps a systems collapse. I don't want to think how that will look. All I can say is it will look extremely ugly. And in private discussions before this video, I've described to you how turbulent the situation is becoming in London, how I was indirectly involved in another incident in London where an individual who was obviously under intense pressure was cracking up and was becoming very threatening and violent in public places and had to be restrained. And I have to say that I'm hearing more and more news all the time about more problems in London and of businesses facing catastrophic closure and of pubs closing and of people being under almost unbearable pressure. So that we're going to have unbearable economic pressure, unbearable political pressure, as the repressive systems crank up, and that we repeated right across Europe. And somewhere or other, at some point or other, the whole thing will blow. But I'm going to deal with that, if I can put it like that, when it happens. I don't want to discuss it too much in advance.
Right. Okay. So, the enemy within strategy.
Yeah.
Which I guess we can coin that phrase now here. The enemy within strategy. I think it's exactly what the U.S. and Canada is employing right now at the moment. So I agree with you. Why wouldn't the EU also employ that enemy within strategy of repression and authoritarianism and stuff like that? Yeah. Okay.
Well, if you listen to Robert Habeck, he already talks that talk, basically. I mean, I remember when there was the discussion over the oil over the oil import ban from Russia. All kinds of people said this was a bad idea. Not just Orban. Lots of people were pushing back on it. And he came along to the European Council meetings with Ursula at his side, and he was basically accusing anybody who wanted to slow down on this utterly foolish and deranged idea. He was basically saying that they were agents of Putin or siding with Putin. And a lot of people become intimidated, they become scared, and they end up going along with things that they know are wrong and a mistake. And I'm afraid we're going to see more of that all the time. And, well, we saw what happened in Canada during the truckers' protests. We've seen what's happened with the yellow vests in France. We're going to see an awful lot more of that, I've no doubt at all, over the next few weeks and months.
All right. We will end it
And
there.
by the way, also,
Locals. Yep.
and by the way, all sorts of scandals. When politicians who talk a different, suggest a different policy, look like they're about to win.
Smears.
We're going to find smears and scandals and videos starting to appear, and all kinds of things like that. All of that. Prepare yourself. We're going to get much more of that over the next few weeks and months.
TheDuran.locals.com and the Duran shop. 10% off. Use the code Good Day. Take care.